Hello to everyone who's joining us from all around the world. We're really delighted to have you here with us. I'm going to jump straight into the introductions just while our Zoom room fills up a little bit, because I want to make the most of the time that we have with our speaker today, Paz Peña. My name is Victoria Adelman, and I work on the Digital Welfare State and Human Rights Project at New York University Law School. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to our event on risk scoring and children's rights in Chile. This event is part of a series of conversations on digital government and human rights. And we've been running this series for well over a year now. This is now the 11th episode of the series. It's really great to see some familiar names in the virtual audience that's joining us here. And for those of you who are joining this conversation series for the first time, a very warm welcome to you. In each of the conversations within this series, my colleagues and I interview an expert about a specific case study on digital government. And through these interviews, we're really aiming to introduce a wide audience of students and academics, technologists and other practitioners to the implications of digital government for human rights. And so far, we've looked at case studies spanning from China's social credit system to the European Union's use of digital technologies in its border control operations and India's enormous biometric digital identification system, for example. And within each of the conversations, which really have covered extremely varied case studies, we're aiming to highlight some of the parallels between the harms and the implications of the move to digital government all around the world. And you can find the recordings of the 10 previous events in this series on our webpage, which Christian has just linked to in the chat here. And on that webpage, you can also find summary blog posts, additional reading materials, and a series of guest blog posts by academics and practitioners who are really working at the cutting edge of issues on digital government and human rights. And we hope that those materials and resources can provide a helpful repository or hub. Without further ado, I want to introduce our conversation today. We're going to focus on Chile's childhood alert system, the Sistema Alerta Niñas. This is an early warning system which assigns risk scores to children and adolescents based on their predicted likelihood of facing harm or abuse, dropping out of school, getting involved with crime or drugs, and other such risks. And on a really basic level, this system uses predictive modeling software, which analyzes historical data to ascertain patterns and correlations between characteristics and outcomes. And it then calculates likelihoods of certain kinds of harm, and it assigns risk scores on that basis. And as we're going to discuss today, this system is really similar in its design to a lot of other risk scoring systems, which you might have heard of, which have been deployed in the child welfare context elsewhere all around the world, from the Netherlands to New Zealand, for example. And today we're especially interested in looking at the implications and the realities of this risk scoring system for children's rights, specifically in Chile. The format of today's conversation is that Christian and I will interview Paz for about 45 minutes, and we'll have 15 minutes for an audience Q&A, and you can send in questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please do start sending in questions as soon as you think of them, because if all of the questions come in kind of towards the end of the session, then it's a bit less likely that we'll be able to ask all of them. And I'll hand it over now to my colleague, Christian van Veen, who's the director of the Digital Welfare State and Human Rights Project.
Thanks, Victoria. And a warm welcome to our guest, Paz Peña, who is an independent expert and consultant on human rights, intersectionality, and digital technologies from Chile. And she's the co-founder of Not My AI. Paz has been a leading voice in examining and thinking about artificial intelligence systems through an intersectional feminist lens, and in highlighting the gendered implications of new technologies. She has run workshops with feminist groups across South America about these issues. And together with her co-author, Joanna Varron, who, by the way, will shortly publish a blog for our Transformer States blog series, Paz has published an excellent article about the childhood alert system, which goes into detail about some of the themes we will be exploring today. And I highly recommend it to you all. Now, Victoria will post a link to it, to the article in the chat, and we will share this alongside many other additional reading materials in the summary blog we will post alongside this video in a few weeks' time. Now, on to our interview, and to start off with some context and background. Today's conversation comes at quite an interesting time in Chile. Just a few weeks ago, Chile's new left-wing president, Gabriel Boric, has been sworn in. And this change in government comes after several years of intense protests in the country. And that context is especially relevant because the childhood alert system that we'll be talking about today was developed and deployed during these years of social unrest. So by way of background, Paz, could you tell us a little bit more about the recent political context in Chile? What were these protests addressing, and what came before this new government?
Well, it is always said, no, there are three big, great boosters of world neoliberalism, no, in the US with Ronald Reagan, the UK with Margaret Thatcher, and Chile with Pinochet, no. But the difference is that in Chile, the great neoliberal turn occurred under a dictatorship, no, that allowed for much, I would say, harsher neoliberal reforms that in democracies. So in that context, the subsidiary state was soon applied in, key areas such as, education, social security, social protection, and so on. But I would say more importantly, neoliberalism was enshrined in the constitution that Pinochet and the local Chicago boys implemented back in 1980, where at least I would say two principles prevail, the subsidiary state, and some sort of very limited spaces for citizen participation. So in 1990, democracy returned, but the constitution only had some limited political changes. So from the 2000s onwards, the generations that grew up in democracy, that grew up with internet, among it is Gabriel Boric, a former leader student, began to protest against various situations of injustice and I would say inequality caused by neoliberalism, including, and this is really important for our analysis, the more than 1,000 poor children that have died in privatized residences in the last 15 years in Chile. And this is because, as in many countries worldwide, children removed from their parents due to, abuse or neglect end up in residences, But the Chilean state outsources these residences to private actors, And this, of course, provides, perverse incentives, including the total lack of control over, the rights of those children and adolescents, by the state. So these children's abuses have been under, public scrutiny, I would say, for, the last 10 years, and are also one of the driving forces to change, or for the idea to change the neoliberal regime here in Chile. So finally, in October of 2019, social uprising begins in many cities of Chile, not only in Santiago, the capital. So this was triggered by something really mundane. It was, I think, the increase in the public transport fares. But somehow this ends up escalating for weeks and weeks, and increasing the pressure of the government to such an extent that it ended up reaching some sort of transversal political agreement to write a new constitution. And that is where we are right now in Chile, trying to write this new constitution and hoping to overcome finally the neoliberal system.
Thanks so much for that political context and background, which is super relevant for our conversation today. and those developments also really resonate with me because of a report that I worked on in 2015 at the end of a country visit together with the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Philip Alston, to Chile. And I was involved in that visit as his senior advisor. And I remember that when we visited Chile at that time, and that's already 7 years ago, there was a real focus in our report on the extreme levels of poverty that still exist in Chilean society, and perhaps even more so on extreme inequalities. The fact that Chile was one of the most unequal countries, if you measure it by Gini coefficient, in the world. And so I wanted to ask you about not just the political context, but also the social context, which is very important for the system we're discussing today, because this predictive risk scoring system, of course, operates within this landscape of inequalities. And you've mentioned that the social unrest and protests of recent years, but also the ones that Borch organized before, occurred in part as a response to high levels of inequality, in response to years of neoliberal policies in the 70s and 80s. And as we're thinking especially about children and the risks to children's rights today, can you tell us who exactly is most likely to suffer from extreme poverty? Who are the ones that we're really talking about here?
Yes, well, have you mentioned something really important, which is, the levels of poverty in Chile. We don't usually talk about that. There's some sort of idea that Chile has this super successful neoliberal project where, poverty is almost, in the minimal records, etc. No? But actually, I have to say that for the first time in 20 years, in 2020, the poverty rate in the country increased. I think about 2 points from 2017. I think it was in 2017, 8.5%, and in 2020 is something like 10.8%. No, so this gives you, clear clues on why there is such a social discontent in Chile. No, and as you mentioned, Chile is one of the unequal countries in the world. No, the simple calculations of the Gini coefficient show that it's one of the countries which have the highest levels of wealth concentration within, for example, the OECD. And actually, we have more inequality than all our direct neighbors in South America, no, Argentina, Peru, and Bolivia. But we cannot really read inequality and poverty without intersectionality, no? Because it is a gender problem, no? There is a gender gap in labor force participation. Women earn less, have lower equality jobs, but even more important, I think, more women than men live in poverty, for example, no? But also, I would say that inequality and poverty in Chile is a problem about race. No, the state, for example, this is for me was super shocking to see this. No, the Chilean state spends 3 times less in areas with a high indigenous population versus territories with low indigenous population. So this has meant, of course, that poverty is higher among people who identify themselves as indigenous. No, and also, for example, the percentage of poor people among immigrants has been the highest since, I think, 2011. No, so another important fact about poverty and inequality, I think, especially for this investigation, is that poverty affects more specific groups of children and adolescents. No, the ones, for example, belonging to migrants, the ones belonging to indigenous peoples, and especially the one who live in rural areas.
Thanks so much for clarifying that, and also interesting what you mentioned about Chile standing out even among Latin American countries in terms of inequality, and also having serious issues with migrants in poverty and indigenous children living in poverty, something that you can easily forget, I think, in the context of Chile, sort of portrayed as a Switzerland of Latin America in a way. against that mapping of child poverty in Chile and the especially deep levels of poverty among migrant and indigenous children in Chile, can you tell us a little bit more about how the Chilean government has approached the issue of child welfare until now? So before it embraced this predictive risk modeling, what was it doing to prevent the violation of children's rights by way of abuse, domestic violence, etc.?
Sure. Well, social policies in Chile follow, the neoliberal principle of focalization. This classic mechanism, for reducing social spending and seeking, greater efficiency in social interventions. And actually, one of the more, I would say, significant nightmares, of the neoliberal state is, to have the data on which people to intervene. And I think an important part of its work in recent years in Chile has been the design of instruments to improve this information, how to get that data to make social interventions. So I think it's also important to know that the social interventions are done as in many neoliberal states under the scheme of management, control, and surveillance of poor people. So in other words, state programs, which are of course limited in budget and scope, do not allow, I would say, the construction of the social fabric, because for the neoliberal ideology, there is not such a thing as a society. This is what as Margaret Thatcher said again and again and again. In the neoliberal state, there are only individuals and families, and there's not such a thing as state and community. And in a sense, this is also what is happening in Chile. The social interventions are focused on individuals and families, but they don't go beyond that, because the ideology doesn't allow that. So in the end, I think the great discussion in Chile has been, focalization versus universal rights. And this discussion became, a priority with the crisis with poor children and adolescents that I mentioned earlier. So in fact, I will say, when Piñera's government arrived back in 2018, one of his promises was actually to make a national agreement for childhood in Chile, because of that crisis. And among the measures that he promised were, on one hand, to enact a law that guarantees the children's rights. We didn't have that. We now have that. But on the other hand, one of the promises was to create a series of alert mechanisms to arrive in time with social interventions for vulnerable children and adolescents. And in that context, the childhood alert system was designed.
Thank you so much, Paz. It's fascinating that this new law that intended to protect children's rights only came, just a few years ago. I think that's a crucial part of the picture. And you just mentioned the childhood alert system, and that was really a key part of the reforms. And I want to kind of ask you about that system now. A lot of our audience members are probably familiar with what predictive risk modeling is, but I wonder if, again, kind of by way of background, you could briefly explain kind of what this childhood alert system is and how it works. And, also, why would a government want to introduce this kind of system? What are they trying to do with this tool?
Sure. So I think it's important to note that this software is designed in the context of the crisis of poor children and adolescents, and amid the social uprising in Chile. So to be clear, the system, the childhood alert system, was announced by Piñera in 2018, and in 2019 the social uprising began. So this is really important to understand our political point regarding this system. So to some extent, this software is the interpretation that a neoliberal government makes of this social problem. No, they believe that the state has failed because it has not arrived on time. And the reason for that is that the lack of an adequate instrument to obtain data and information to make the social intervention. So in other words, the problem is not the limited scope of their social interventions and the abandonment of the social fabric that these kind of interventions provoke. For them, for these neoliberal governments, the problem is the instrument, and the way to fix the instrument to get the data is through technology. So in this context, the childhood alert system is a software that seeks to estimate and predict the level of risk of children and adolescents of suffering, some violation of their rights in the future. And to do so, it examines and learns, from past administrative databases created by the state, which provides information on children and adolescents who have already been subjected to rights violations, and then studies their life trajectory and identifies, a set of, individual, environmental, and family and peer conditions that tend to occur when there is, a high risk of violation of rights. So the children and adolescents currently facing these conditions will be those who could potentially need support to mitigate the risks factors that surround them. So in this way, an alert is raised when a case is detected by the system, which should be a precedent to be assessed by the social workers operating in the local childhood offices, which in these offices are in some way some sort of institutionality, especially created for the software to function.
Thank you so much. So this is really a sort of software tool that's then combined also with institutional reform, and then having kind of the interplay between social workers in the local offices with this kind of more centralized tool. I mean, some of what you've been saying about the sort of more individualization that kind of goes on within this, the design of this software is really similar to some of the tools that have been deployed all around the world. And for example, in my home country of the United Kingdom, where the idea is to kind of predict and find the quote troubled families. And some of those in our audience will know that predictive modeling is being used all around the world, and for example, across several states in the United States to predict children's risk of mistreatment and abuse in a very similar way. And so Chile's childhood alert system is kind of a small piece of a global picture where we're seeing very similar risk scoring systems proliferating in the child welfare context. And I want to ask you about this international dimension, because it's especially relevant when we're talking about Chile, because we've been seeing effectively active technology transfer into Chile. So can you tell us who developed this tool and kind of point to some of those international dynamics?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, for me, this factor was like a big surprise when we began, to investigate the system. With Joana Barón in Coding Rights, we made a super general survey of, artificial intelligence systems deployed by states in Latin America, and we were super surprised by the fact that the major suppliers of these systems were university consortiums, in addition to the usual suspect of private sector, Microsoft and those big actors. But for me, actually, I believe that universities give some sort of different symbolic weight to these technologies that will be worth of studying, I think, in the future. But in the case of the childhood alert system, the pilot was developed by in partnership between two universities, no? The Center for Social Data Analytics at the Auckland University of Technology and the Public Innovation Laboratory, the GovLab, at the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, which is a Chilean university, no? So it was interesting to see that the Center for Social Data Analytics, in many of its forms, no, it was a different name before, it was in a different university, but anyhow, the Center of Social Data Analytics has been involved in the development of this system in the United States and in New Zealand, no, and in both countries with much public controversy, and that was fascinating to see, you know, in the research. For example, in both countries, in United States, for example, Victoria Eubanks analyzed this system in her book Automating Inequality, which, by the way, is one of my favorite books about, you know, the matter. And in New Zealand, for example, the system was not implemented in the end, no, after like a huge public scandal that you can actually see in the press, no, and there's a lot of documentation on that in different, you know, research projects. So I think that was really fascinating, but I think it's also worth to mention that the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez is also, you know, it has, you know, a background that is really interesting for this case, no? La Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez is a private university that started in the late 80s, no? As a business school, and thanks to, you know, one of the last big neoliberal reforms of higher education carried out during the dictatorship, the Pinochet dictatorship. And its dean actually is Harald Bayer, which was a former Minister of Education of the first government of Sebastián Piñera. And he is a well-known Chilean neoliberal politician, no? So what I mean is that it's not strange that these kind of systems that are so tied to neoliberalism are being implemented by these universities.
Thank you. I think it's really important to look at some of the kind of actors and entities that are behind the development of some of these systems. So we see the same university behind the US, New Zealand, and Chilean systems. And then we also see this kind of very right-wing kind of university background in the Chilean context. I think it's really interesting. And I definitely second your recommendation of Virginia Eubanks's book, Automating Inequality.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was, you know, a crucial kind of key figure in mounting criticism of this specific system developed by these same kind of researchers in the Pennsylvania context in the US. And so to kind of pick up on your mention of the fact that the same system received criticism and kind of caused scandals in New Zealand and in the United States, the Chilean system has also been criticized by civil society organizations on the ground to some extent, and obviously including by yourself, by researchers such as you and Joanna. And you've written about how this system is really far from neutral. You've talked a little bit about this already. And you've talked about how it kind of consistently and disproportionately focuses on low-income families and is effectively an exercise in, quote, poverty profiling. So can you tell us a little bit about what that means and kind of why this kind of approach to people who are living in poverty might be problematic?
Sure. So I think we believe that the problems of these systems are, you know, at several levels, no, even without going into analyzing the code itself, no. So, for example, one problem, and for me, what is more important, especially in the context that we're living, the political context that we're living in Chile, is that this system automates a political and ideological position to address the social problems of poor children and adolescents. No? In other words, it automates targeting, no? This system tries to improve targeting in order to reduce social spending, no? And amid the political crisis of an entire nation without, with neoliberalism, we believe that implementing this system at this time is at least hasty, no? Second, I think actually to improve targeting, you need more data, which means more control and surveillance of a certain population, no? Which is part of the critics that Victoria Eubanks does, no? Third, I think, since the system does not apply to higher income children and adolescents whose rights are at risk of being violated also, no? The system, basically what it does is to overrepresent poor people, which implies, discrimination of all kinds, no? But we also believe that the system's results could be at least questionable, no? Since the system uses databases created for other purposes, with different criteria. They only, took different databases that were already there to try to make predictions. So I think what we have to ask is, why do we naturalize, the idea of, data for the taking, no? Isn't that data belong to bodies and people's experience, no? What this system for me is doing and what the Chilean state is doing is simply data extractivism in a way, no? So I think we need also to think about, the amount of naturalizations that we have in terms of, take data from poor people, because it's there, because poor people will not probably know what we are doing with that data. And I think that kind of levels of, that kind of problematic levels, sometimes we don't analyze that. We just tend to go to the code, and we don't actually weight the other social and political contexts that for me are super important in terms of these developments.
Thank you. I think that's a really important point of kind of this very naturalized assumption that if we want to predict harm and abuse, let's only look at databases covering people who are using public services and who are living in poverty.
And you have the problem of consent, for example, no? Are you asking for consent? And what is the power relationship around that consent? Because if you depend of giving consent to get support from the state, probably you're gonna give the consent. You're not gonna analyze. You don't gonna put any problems. So I think the ethical problem is also there, super present, and we tend not to talk also about that.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of what you're saying also relates to other kind of intersectionalities as well, because you've talked about the kind of skew and the disproportionate focus on kind of populations who are more living in poverty. But I wonder if you could also tell us a little bit about the other possible biases that you see as potentially existing within this system, particularly in the within the databases that it already uses. And actually, before I kind of go to that question, I just want to remind the audience as well to please send in your own questions through the Q&A functions, and we will come to them in about 10 minutes time. So anyway, over to you, Paz, about the kind of biases.
Yeah. So an important part of our work is to adapt feminist theories and practices that help us to analyze these technological systems. And this is mainly because these systems work based on binary choices, which leave out, the social complexities of, identity, bodies, life trajectories, etc. Which are, of course, elements that feminism has always, denounced. In addition, these systems work with certain universalizations of social and cultural categories, that are, very dangerous, including, of course, the category of the white male, So in this context, it was interesting for us to see how in the instruction manual of this system that we analyze and that you can get in our website. It's in Spanish, but it's really worth to read it. Its creators, the creators of the system, discarded the analysis of race, as a problematic factor in the results of the system. They said actually that, we believe in Chile there are no problems regarding race. And, as for gender, they did not even mention the gender as a problem, And that is, to say the least, irresponsible, when, as I said before, there is evidence of how factors such as race, immigration, and gender are, categories of special attention when we talk about poverty and inequality in Chile. But in particular, it is worrisome, especially considering the evidence on how dangerous is, the idea that of believing that algorithms do not see skin color, which is an idea that has been largely developed by, for example, Uja Benjamin, in her book. And I think we are facing that danger here with the childhood alert system, because they basically don't even consider race as a problem.
I just want to take us to a slightly more positive register now, Paz, by talking about efforts to push back against the kind of harms that you've just addressed and the discrimination that is involved in this system. And going back again, as we did before, to the international dimension here, I was wondering if you think that the fact that such systems have been deemed inappropriate, harmful, and frankly useless in other national contexts could be helpful here. And I'm thinking, for instance, of a scoring tool for the risks faced by children in the US state of Illinois, which was flagged, which has flagged hundreds of young children as 100% likely to be killed or seriously injured, while failing to flag any of the children who did actually die tragically in high-profile mistreatment cases. So do you think that the fact that some of these systems are being scrapped will help activists in Chile push for the abandonment of this particular system?
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. International cooperation in, for example, documenting the trajectory of this system is super important, very important. And in our particular work with Joana Barón, it has been, I would say, fundamental. But I think we need to be careful about one thing. If these systems, for example, and because of the pressure of activism and academia, etc., if these systems are not longer implemented in the, for example, global north, they will be more strongly implemented in the global south. Let's see, for example, Facebook, and data protection. So you have this important system of data protection in the EU, but that is not a problem for Facebook, because Facebook is going to find another source for extract data, and that is the global south. So I think we need international cooperation, but also we need international solidarity. We cannot be satisfied with ban this kind of developments only in the global north. We need to push for some sort of global action, to take actions around these systems. And in the area of solidarity, we need to do a lot of things, but sometimes really simple things. For example, these kind of interviews, this kind of documentation, super important. But also we need to translate case documentations into many, many languages. One of the problems that we find with Joana was that most of the information around these systems is in English, So you have a lot of hurdles to overcome to actually understand the problems of these systems or the different international experiences, you know. And I think also that we need, I would say, some sort of coordinated push, you know, with the international community for, you know, these agencies that tend to fund these tech developments. I'm talking about the World Bank, you know, the Inter-American Bank, you know, that are so fascinated by technology and are so fascinated by neoliberalism. At least, you know, we have to push them to raise the standards of active transparency of these systems. No, transparency is was for us one of the most, you know, I would say difficult things to get the information. No, even though we, you know, have transparency requirements, you know, the quality of the answers of, you know, those requirements were really lousy, and I think it's important to push for that, especially when these developments are funded by these big institutions, no? And I think we also need to include you know, critical analysis of technology in issues as simple as, you know, digital skills. No, we like to have the idea of digital skills, trying to, you know, teach people how to be part of the you know, digital economy, but we never also talk you know, of how we can, you know, improve a critical analysis of technologies, no? And we need urgently, I think, to democratize this discussion. And for us, this is actually the key element in our project, no? We cannot wait for the academia, we cannot wait for the specialists to analyze all the systems. We need, you know, to democratize the critical analysis in other organizations. For us, the most important thing is to do it with grassroots feminist organizations, because we know that they have, you know, this analytical framework that can help to have a critical look at these technologies. But I think that is something so important to do, and I think that the international cooperation and the international solidarity can help to achieve it.
Thanks for that answer, and also for flagging the relevance of having conversations like these to cross those national boundaries. It's one of the reasons why we've set up this conversation series. Although I would be the first to admit that the fact that we're doing this in English, of course, then creates its own new barriers, despite us being able to reach out across borders via this Zoom platform. We're still talking in a certain language that excludes many people from the conversation. So that's a point well taken. You already touched upon this just now in your answer, but in taking a specifically feminist approach to your work, you've at times been critical of human rights as a framework and as an approach in addressing some of the issues that we have discussed today. So I was wondering how you see the relationship between a feminist approach and a human rights approach on the other hand, and whether there are ways in which these two approaches can combine and overlap usefully, or do you think that sometimes you're working in parallel in a way to those operating in the human rights space like us?
Well, I have been working on, you know, the digital rights agenda for many years, which is nothing more than human rights in the digital context, no? And I sincerely believe really that human rights are one of the most important tools, you know, for the accountability of technological systems, okay? But I think it is a tool that needs to be complemented, you know, mainly because human rights are based on the universalization of the Western white male, no? And I think that, you know, approaches from intersectionality, for example, which Black feminism rescued, allow the tool of human rights to have a more, I would say, diverse scope, because it allows complex social subjects to emerge, no? And I believe that, I don't know, I believe that this synergy, between these two approaches, from human rights and feminism and gender, can be seen often in the critical analysis of technologies. You can see that. I mean, in the work of, for example, Ruha Benjamin, you can see how human rights and the approach of intersectionality is, bringing new approaches to the critical analysis of these technologies. And for example, a very clear case, is the idea, as we were talking before with Victoria, is the idea that data protection is based on consent, for example, to respect privacy. So the only human rights approach will say, well, we need consent, and consent has to be informed and blah blah blah. But when you ask yourself, who is capable today of giving free consent? The analysis becomes more complex, and I think the human rights agenda is enriched in a way, when you apply, the intersectionality analysis to social situations.
Couldn't agree more. Just I had one more follow-up question, which sort of was triggered by something you said about institutionality before. It triggered a memory of that visit I mentioned earlier with the UN to Chile in 2015, where one of our conclusions was that this whole notion of institutionality, and especially its Spanish translation, which I won't try here, was sort of missing in the Chilean context. So maybe there are constitutional rights protections, but was sort of an institutional structure to make sure that those rights were actually implemented in practice, and that was mostly missing. And then I was suddenly wondering whether the fact that institutionality has been missing in Chile, perhaps because of that experience and experimentation with neoliberalism in the 70s and in the 80s, that would make Chile more vulnerable for the sort of risk scoring systems that we've talked about today, because they are sort of landing in a certain environment in which the institutional structures and safeguards that might be there elsewhere, for instance, in the United States or New Zealand, where we talked about before, are not here. And that maybe talking about sort of international borrowing from other case studies, that we should also be careful to really think about the specific political and institutional context in which a system lands, which you can't just copy the assumptions from a case study from another country just because it's a very different country with a very different history. Maybe this question doesn't make much sense, but I was just suddenly triggered by what you said about institutionality before.
No, actually, it makes a lot of sense. So in this manual of the system that I completely recommend to read it, and please translate it as you can, because it's really, really worth it. In this manual, the creators of the system, where they say that race is not important, etc., they also says something really interesting, actually. And they say, because Chile doesn't have like a really data protection framework, it has it, but it's really bad. People really don't care about privacy and data protection. They are so used to, give away their data, so they really don't care about that. So this is actually, the manual says, this is like an advantage for the system. So you're not gonna see people protesting for data protection as you can probably get it, in some European country. But in Chile, you don't gonna find that, so it's not a problem. So your question, Christian, made me think about that. How are actually these different institutionalities, institutions, and or the way that the legal systems are deployed, but also the cultural aspects of every country is also considered by these creators, which I think is fascinating, because we're not only talking about, technical stuff, we're talking about political stuff, no? We're talking about strategies and how that factors can actually be key for the success of the system or in every country. So yeah, absolutely. I think it's super, and for me, it's super important to see, that differences, and also not only the differences, but also the nuances that, for example, the neoliberal systems have in different countries. No, I know that in the UK, and I'm looking at Victoria, you have a neoliberal system, but the developments of the neoliberal system are different because many reasons, cultural reasons, power reasons, etc. So I really think that we also need to be very careful about those nuances at the time when we need to analyze and compare the systems that are developing in our countries.
Absolutely, and in looking at those differences, we see it's somewhat shocking that the creators of the system would be so explicit on paper of the advantages of this global South context.
Absolutely,
people don't have rights and don't care, etc. I want to take us to the Q&A from the audience now, as we just have a little bit of time left. And the first question that we have from Isabel Nino is, I was wondering if you could provide any data and talk about how this predictive modeling software to assess children's abuse is having a disparate impact on migrants specifically, and especially if you have any comments about its impact on migrants specifically from Haiti.
A really interesting question, because we have a lot of migrants from Haiti and from Venezuela also, because of the humanitarian crisis on those two countries. The straight answer is that we don't know yet. And the reason is that only 3 weeks ago, at the beginning of March, a few days before leaving office, the former president Sebastián Piñera enacted the law institutionalizing this software. No, so until now we were dealing with a system that was only a pilot in certain cities of Chile. No, so now is when the researchers have to look, cautiously, the results. Although, again, in principle, we believe that it will take a quite long time, because of the difficulties of getting results through transparency requirements. This is something that is it's going to take time. In addition, it is difficult, I think, to have how can I say it, a sincere interaction with the social workers in the local children's offices. And this is because the offices were designed to contain this software. No, in other words, if the software does not exist, the offices do not exist either. No, so it won't be easy, to have a sincere talk with social workers regarding the software, because if the software, is questioned, then the local offices will be questioned too. So this is something that we have to, to see very cautiously, and I think we need to have some sort of strategy, to get that information there. So that's why in that context we aim, as a project, we aim to work with, social organizations with feminist roots, so that they know about this and other similar systems and can carry out this research themselves. We believe that if we do this, in a collective way, it's going to be easier to get more information around what are the results, especially results with immigrants. This is also very interesting because one of the biggest problems that the Chilean state has today is that they don't have enough information of immigrants because they are not part of the the system, because they are illegal, no? So this is really interesting to see also, no? Because this obsession that we have to improve the instrument to get data is actually, more difficult with immigrants today in Chile, no? Because of the amount of immigrants that are not part of the system. So I think we're gonna see, this is my, what I expect, but I think that we're gonna see very interesting results with immigrants that are in the system and with immigrants that are not in the system, no? And what kind of discriminations, the differentialities of that, I think is something that we're gonna see very soon after this system is deployed in the whole country.
Thank you. That's a really interesting answer. And I think it also goes to this question of what data are we collecting? And there seems to be this kind of focus on the data that will improve the tool, like you say, but less of a focus on measuring how it's impacting people and different groups. And that takes me to another one of the questions here, which is focusing on the kind of harms and the explicit, the kind of consequences of this system. So, where predictive modeling is used, children might be taken away from their families, and this might flag families for intrusive investigations. Can you tell us if the risk scores have had these kinds of life-changing consequences, or what the harms have been in Chile of this system?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first is that we don't know yet, but to be honest, today the state is well known between poor families as the one who take away your children. No, they know about that. So the state is not necessarily seen as your, I don't know, friend. No, it's far away from that. No, it's a menace. So because of that, the pressure of being part of this kind of system is huge. No, and that is why actually we also are looking very carefully about things as consent, no? Because you need consent to be part of this system. Actually, it's part of the conditions of this manual, no? To have the consent. And actually, the manual also says, for example, why don't you go? This is impressive. No? They say, why don't you go first with women that are, having little children? Because women that have little children need more state support. And they're gonna probably say, yes, they're gonna consent on this system because they're gonna need the help of the state, no? So actually you can see, that kind of problems that that are important to consider. And it's not only, the problem is not only the I don't know, the flag that can be put on these families around discrimination, etc. It's also that, but I think we have to go earlier and see what are the problems regarding this kind of human rights, no? The human rights of your data, the protection of your data, to have an informed consent, to not pressure to be part of the system. And I think that are things that sometimes we tend to forget to analyze. We are waiting for the results, and sometimes the problems with the systems are way before the system is implemented. No, is how they get the information and how they actually play with the necessities of poor people to get help and to get support from the state.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we're now at an hour, so we have to stop there. Thank you so much, Paz, for all of your insights today and for this really interesting and rich conversation. Thank you very much, Christian, and to our audience as well for joining. We've recorded today's conversation, and the recording is going to be available on our webpage for the conversation series in about 2 weeks' time, along with a blog post that summarizes the discussion and some further reading materials and links to any books that have been mentioned in today's conversation, for example, Virginia Eubanks's book and Ruha Benjamin's book as well. So please do feel free to share this recording with others. We'll share it with you when it's available. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Paz, again.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you.